In case you've been living under a rock the past few weeks, amidst the police protests following the murder of folk hero and all-around saint George Floyd, protesters have taken to destroying monuments they see as symbols of the systemic racism embedded into the country's history. Meanwhile, the commander-in-chief has signed an executive order protecting those statues and monuments, as if vandalism wasn't already illegal. So, are protesters justified in removing these historical monuments, or are they just finding some excuse to vandalize public property? Destroying public property is serious business, and if we're gonna do it, we're gonna need some pretty solid arguments for doing so. That's why we're gonna first address all the shit arguments, those lines of reasoning that are too stupid to even factor into serious conversations. Let's start with one of the most popular lines being echoed by mainstream conservatives, that
we must commemorate history, both the good and the bad, because America.
First of all, there's a reason why there aren't a bunch of swastikas hanging around Germany these days. And imagine if there was still a city in Russia named Stalingrad. There's a difference between remembering and learning from history and putting it on a fucking pedestal. I doubt conservatives really care about history that much anyway. When's the last time you saw some redneck opening a textbook or visiting the museum? What's that? They're destroying a Roosevelt monument at a museum too? Okay, that brings us to shit argument number 2. Just because you don't like a statue doesn't automatically make it right for you to destroy it. I don't know what genius toppled Ulysses S. Grant's statue, because last I remember he was the Union General. And sure, Thomas Jefferson owned slaves, but he was kind of a founding father and a president, you know? And sure, Francis Scott Key was actually pro-slavery, but he wrote the Star-Spangled Banner and... never mind. I take that back. Fuck Francis Scott Key for writing the most boring song ever that we all have to pretend to like. Point is, we honor people for their contributions, not for being perfect. Look, I'll show you what I mean. This is Plato. He's one of the founders of Western philosophy as well as the founder of Western political philosophy. It has been said that the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. But he also thought women were inferior to men, so let's destroy all statues of him now, huh? And this is Henry Ford. He developed the assembly line and was so good at mass production that the car became affordable to middle-class Americans. He helped popularize welfare capitalism, the radical notion that employees should be treated like people. But he was also kind of an anti-Semite. Can't have any statues of him around, can we? This is Jesus of Nazareth.
Whoa, off topic. Let's save this one for a different video, eh?
Fine, but you get the point. We commemorate people for their great achievements or what they represent to remind people of what everyday people can strive to achieve. I'm sure you could find some pretty big flaws with anybody who's ever been statuified. Besides, the moment you start canceling historical figures for every single little fault they do, you're basically just inviting people from the future to go along and cancel us for everything we did wrong. Just imagine that when eventually everybody goes vegan, how bad we'll look because our society eats meat. Do you want all your achievements to be canceled out just for your dietary choice? If not, then don't be a hypocrite. Just remember, nobody is perfect or even close, and if we're gonna honor anyone at all, we shouldn't expect them to be. Which brings us to the next point. A particularly irreverent person might actually accept the arguments presented in the previous segment. Maybe we shouldn't have statues of anybody at all. Maybe we shouldn't be honoring them because they aren't perfect, and holding them up as some sort of ideal or pinnacle of humanity is both unrealistic and pointless. I mean, you don't need to honor George Washington to value what he valued, which is freedom and nonpartisan cooperation. Clearly, the number of George Washington statues is nowhere near enough to stop political parties from amassing power. So what's the point of all this bullshit if it won't even do anything anyway? I actually find this line of reasoning pretty compelling, but the removal of all public statues is part of a wider discussion than can be covered in today's context. What we can take away from this is, there are two primary questions you need to ask yourself before you decide to destroy public property. One, is it a substantial detriment to society to keep that statue around? And two, is it worth the social unrest that committing such an act causes? Or maybe the social unrest is your goal after all.
I see you're already recycling assets from the previous video.
In reference to question 1, we should address one final argument.
It's just a statue. Who even cares?
This is a pretty useless argument, not necessarily because statues are somehow inherently harmful, but it could easily be used to support either side of the debate. A protester could say the destruction of a statue is the least of our problems since a hunk of metal or stone barely matters at all. But a Trumpkin could similarly claim that it's not even worth destroying at all. The amount of impact each statue makes will come into play later on, but for now, let's pick on the guy who's easiest to pick on. Christopher Columbus. He didn't even prove the Earth was round. Everybody already knew that. He didn't even discover America either. Leif Erikson beat him to it half a millennium ago, not to mention all the indigenous people living there already, whom he promptly massacred. Back when Italians were the racism victims of the day, they pushed Wash Irving's fantastic Columbus to prove Italians
Weren't so bad after all.
Don't know why they didn't just offer Americans some pasta or something. Who could possibly reject the edible embodiment of God himself? Pasta. Safe to say, all Columbus had was his good luck saving him from his own persistent idiocy. Next up are Confederate symbols. If you asked a conservative, you might be told that the Confederate flag was about
Preserving the Southern way of life.
aka slaves,
And standing up for states' rights.
to own slaves. I actually agree that the Confederates had every right to secede, even if for no other reason than,
We felt like it.
and the war itself was not about abolishing slavery, though Lincoln spun it that way later on to keep the war effort going. But absolutely none of that matters, because at the end of the day, the Confederacy is still inextricably connected to the racist ideology that led to its creation. As far as I'm concerned, there is no coherent argument which can separate Jefferson Davis and the Confederate flag from its interpretation as a symbol of historical racism. If anything, it just casts doubt on whether we should honor Union warhawks like Abraham Lincoln either. I'm a bit more sympathetic to Robert E. Lee for being a not that bad guy. But again, statues are not about the person necessarily, but what they symbolize. So again, the idea of honoring Confederate figures is basically without merit. Now for the more important question, is it worth the trouble? You see, destroying statues isn't just about removing symbols of racism from the public. It's also about sending a political message. When you destroy public property, you're essentially giving the public process the finger, saying, not later, now. If the action goes unaddressed from public leaders, it tells others who may not be as heroic as you that they too can get away with some public property destruction of their own. More importantly though, it provides fuel for the oppositional fire, so to speak. Being that bad apple reduces the credibility of the entire movement in the public eye. Donald Trump has lumped both peaceful protesters and rioters into one generalized dangerous mob and used that as an excuse to tighten law enforcement, which completely defeats the purpose of the defund the police message. If you're going to take drastic action, you'd better bring drastic results. So let's see the fruits of our revolutionary action. Wait, that's it? Sure, you got a few racist statues taken down and ruined the defund the police movement's traction in the process. But seriously though, who the hell takes a stroll through the park, sees a statue of Jefferson Davis and suddenly gets inspired to become racist? At the end of the day, a poorly placed statue doesn't do much damage beyond shattering your fragile ego. So yes, Confederate monuments have no place displayed to the American public, and I'm glad to see them go. But taking the matter into your own hands ultimately does more harm than good. As we can see all over the country, leaders are voting to voluntarily remove Confederate statues. I mean, sure, it's just some reactive political lip service in response to the huge protests of the day. But the fact is, you got what you wanted. It's best not to play your cards all at once, because people will grow numb of all the outrage culture that's taken a hold of the public today. So before you go wreck some shit, tell yourself, it's just a fucking statue! I wonder, if I'd concluded that the statue destruction was justified, would I be violating the imminent lawless action standard? Could I be arrested? If so, then great. Not only do I have to be worried about getting cancelled, I might also get taken into custody for attempting to incite insurrection. Anyway, for those of you who happen to be anime fans, I remixed a song from an SNK soundtrack. You can listen to it here on my YouTube channel or visit my Bandcamp and download it for free.
I'm and I approve this message.